like to begin by thanking Carol Brule in particular and the organizers of this wonderful event for their courage and their energy and the great merit that they have in addressing what is, I believe, the greatest political issue of our time.
And without further ado, Webster Tarpley, author and lecturer.
Let us first address what I would like to call the 9/11 myth. It is, I submit, a fantastic construct. It is the story of the 19 hijackers, bin Laden, the laptop in the cave, and so forth. This myth has now become the basis of the government of the United States. The two are inextricably linked. And the survival of the myth is, of course, the key to the re-usurping campaign of the current tenant of the White House. And I would submit to you that the overriding political priority for every person of goodwill on this planet is to dismantle this myth, to critique it, to deconstruct it, and to put it into the dustbin of history. I would further suggest that if the 9/11 myth cannot be deconstructed, that the current tenant of the White House is likely to remain in place. And I invite you to pause for a second and think about what such a perspective would mean. It essentially means a second term beyond the reach of public opinion with bureaucratic, authoritarian, totalitarian tendencies even stronger than the ones we see today. The 9/11 story was the answer to every question at the White House briefing. This is back when it was Ari Fleischer, and the answer is 9/11, 9/11, 9/11. And if you have a follow-up, the answer to that is 9/11 too. Here it is again. Now it's not Ari anymore, it's Scott, but the story is still the same. 9/11, 9/11. So is it going to be 9/11? Yes, it's 9/11, 24/7. Franklin D. Roosevelt once told us that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The current tenant of the White House tells us that we have to be afraid, deathly afraid, all the time. It is, if you will, a new reign of terror being brought about by the Bush people. My initiation to the study of terrorism began as the study of international terrorism in Europe in the late 1970s, and in particular, the Moro case in 1978. This was the kidnapping and murder of the former Italian prime minister. The agency that had carried out the kidnapping and murder was NATO intelligence, the combination of the United States, the British, and their friends inside the secret services of the NATO alliance. When Moro had been kidnapped, the Italian newspapers were sent a photograph of him with a flag in the background that said Red Brigade. So what we did was to take out the Red Brigades and put in the British flag here to suggest that the agency that had kidnapped him was very much in the West. And has been mentioned, his widow later reported that he had been threatened very directly and very personally by Henry Kissinger, saying, if you don't stop what you're doing, there's going to be big trouble for you. This is my major work, George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography. I would submit that it still stands as the only thorough, comprehensive, and critical biography of the former president. It was issued in 1992, and it has been available since October 1996 for free to download on the Internet, so if you haven't downloaded it, please do. We are now entering the wilderness of mirrors, where deception is the primary concern of all practitioners. I call this state-sponsored terrorism because I am convinced that most or much terrorism in the modern world is state-sponsored terrorism. It's made up of three subsystems, if you will, or three subgroups inside a universe of discourse which is controlled in the manner of brainwashing by the controlled corporate media and their systematic falsifications. Now, the first group I would point to within this universe of discourse, the patsies, the people that are going to take the fall for terrorist actions, that are going to be accused, that are going to be put in jail, executed, and so forth, are generally mental wrecks that we can qualify as patsies, dupes, useful idiots, fanatics. They're interspersed with police agents, double agents, provocateurs, Oswalds, if you will. It helps if they're borderline psychotics. It helps if they have something to do, some inkling or smattering of what they're accused of doing. But generally, these are people of very limited mental equipment who are suggestible, who are manipulable, and who are guided into certain things. If they don't do them, those things can be done by doubles, and they can then be blamed on them. And if you need to do it on a larger scale, you can set up a group of patsies, perhaps led by a conscious agent. Or you can set up a false flag operation that is all agents but pretends to be one of the same group as the patsies. These people often do a great deal to get themselves noticed. They have to get into fights with people. They have to be abrasive. They have to be noticeable. They're ideologues. They talk a lot. These are the people that are going to be blamed for the action. And the critical question, of course, is always, are they physically capable of carrying out the action that they are accused of? However, there's another group, the moles. FBI agent Colleen Rowley at one point said, "We thought that our bosses in FBI headquarters were a bunch of moles." Well, moles would be, and I think this is an important point, a private network of operatives who have penetrated the government. In other words, it's a group of people who are not loyal to the constitutional chain of command, but to the orders that are coming from some command center outside. So a private network. Once the terrorist action has taken place, if it is successful, it will increasingly seem as if the moles have taken over the entire government, which is what, of course, they intend to do. So as you look back on it historically, it will look more and more like the moles have taken over everything. And part of that is simply the bureaucratic inertia and the bureaucratic self-preservation of the bureaucratic structures in which the moles are ensconced. Now, everybody hears about the patsies, but nobody hears about the professional killers unless things go very, very wrong. It happened in Britain in the past 12 months. It turned out that one of the main killers of a Protestant terror group was actually an agent of MI5, whereas it's the patsies that are going to go out and take the hit. Before the action takes place, the task of the moles is to make sure that nobody interferes with the patsies. The patsies have got to be as public as possible and as visible as possible, but at the same time, they can't be thrown in jail. Otherwise, they can't fulfill their function. Once the crime has been committed, the task of the moles is to mercilessly indict, imprison, execute, accuse these same patsies. And if necessary, they have to be eliminated, right? Oswald said, "I never killed anybody, no sir," and he was dead soon after that. So these people are expendable. These people may be expendable too, but it doesn't take place in public, so we know very little of it. And again, none of this can happen without the brainwashed world of the controlled corporate media. Now, in the past couple of days, we've had the sessions of the Kane-Hamilton Commission. This is a colossal exercise in a logical fallacy called begging the question. Begging the question, they assume what has to be proven. In other words, you're told, prove the official story of 9/11. What they do then is assume the official story as 9/11 is given and then go on to show how that this is actually the case. So this is simply a logical fallacy. Now, it doesn't rule out the possibility that interesting things may come up along the way, but this is largely coincidental because the entire thrust of the exercise goes in the opposite direction. So I suggest to you that this is a bankrupt experiment. And I would offer the following reality check, especially for the Kane-Hamilton people. There is no proof of any kind really, in the public domain, that September 11th can be attributed to Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, or anything of the sort. There's no connection to Afghanistan. Director Mueller of the FBI has admitted that. There's no proof of who the hijackers were. There's no proof that there were any hijackers. There's no proof of foreign origin of the attacks. And nobody has ever been convicted for this in any shape or form in any kind of a trial. The official version, I would suggest, breaks down on 14 major points. Why were the alleged terrorists not arrested before the fact? And simply the notion that they could get away with breaking the laws and running amok for so long in such a flagrant and blatant way suggests that they have been protected by a network of moles. The moles in the FBI that ignored the Minneapolis report, the Phoenix memorandum, and so forth. The moles that Colleen Rowley complained about. Here are, of course, the 19. Nobody knows really anything about them. There are reports that 7 of them are still alive. Those have been denied, but the denials are not convincing. The other very interesting question about these 19 characters, whoever they were, is how were the alleged terrorists physically capable of carrying out the alleged actions? And that means, how do you take over an aircraft with plastic knives, box cutters, or anything of the sort? Therefore, we have questions like, were these planes replaced by drones? The distinguished German researcher Gerhard Wisniewski has advanced the hypothesis that they were replaced by drone aircraft. Others have argued that they were controlled, remote controlled by the Global Hawk technology and ran into the buildings that way. The question, of course, is a supermarket caliber terrorist is not going to be able to perform a tour de force of aeronautical skill. These are people that would have had a hard time getting a driver's license in most states. And this is Wisniewski's 9/11 book, one of the bestsellers in Germany, and of course he's put a television program on German primetime news. Another question, were the alleged phone messages from the passengers and the crew authentic? Somehow a lot depends on whether Barbara Olson really said the things she was alleged to have said. These messages have never really been officially published. Various parts of them have been made public, and they're highly suspect. As, for example, Andreas von Bülow argued in his book on the CIA and the 11th of September, it's within the repertory of a serious intelligence agency to be able to have imitators who can sound like somebody. Under conditions of stress, they can convince acquaintances, even friends of somebody, if maybe the connection is bad or something like this. They can essentially mimic the voice of somebody. And a lot of these phone calls are to people that are not within the immediate circle or family of the people involved. Why were no arrests ever made for insider trading? How can it be possible that the SEC and all these other agencies cannot track down people who made these colossal bets on airline stocks? Why was there no air defense? What was the reason for the stand down? Why were there no interceptors? The long-established standard operating procedures of the Federal Aeronautics Administration, the North American Air Defense Command, were all simply flaunted. And it's a case of incompetence that is relatively circumscribed. Before and after, these things tended not to happen, but on this day, essentially, all the rules were simply suspended. And there'd be a lot to say about each one of them. Obviously, each one of the 14 points hides hundreds of individual questions. Then there's the problem that, by and large, historically, modern fireproof skyscrapers do not collapse as a result of fire. The Meriden Plaza Hotel in Philadelphia in the early 1990s burned until it was a gutted shell, but it did not collapse. So was the World Trade Center a case of controlled demolition? Were charges incorporated into the static structure of the building? Gerhard Wisniewski shows photographs that this is the case, that this is what was done. One of the problems, of course, is that in the case of the second plane hitting the South Tower, the majority of the kerosene was burned in this huge cloud that you see, and therefore was not available to stoke the fire on the inside of the building. Ironically, this building collapsed before the North Tower. And then even more puzzling, what happened to Building 7 of this complex, a 40-story skyscraper in most cities, which collapsed in the afternoon? And there's a very suspicious exchange of comments between the owner of the complex and various authorities, which raises the question again of controlled demolition. This happened at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. What explains Bush's behavior on September 11th? The long reading lesson, the flying around in Air Force One at low levels, going to Louisiana, going to Nebraska. The 11th point, why was the Islamic world blamed on the basis of absolutely no evidence pointing to the Islamic world? Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are, of course, long-standing CIA assets. The way that this was done seems to have more to do with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis with the Richard Pearl clean break, with the William Crystal Project for a New American Century, and so forth. And perhaps two, we have the Guantanamo concentration camp. We have the possibility of being declared an enemy combatant any day, any time of day. What explains the shift to preemptive aggression? Is it, as Mike and Ruppert and others have argued, declining world oil production? Is it an attempt to preserve the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency? Is it the fact that we're in a very severe world economic depression? Is it all of these? In other words, the motivation for the group of people that are now running the show. And I think the most important question, who are the real September criminals? Generally speaking, people have accepted the idea that Bush and the administration lied wildly on Iraq.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
I don't think it's too much to ask people to consider that they may have lied on these other matters. Again, the identification of bin Laden, naturally, he seems to have taken credit, but this has absolutely no standing. Any police agency in the world has to have tests to see if somebody who confesses to a crime actually has enough inside knowledge of the crime to have been able to carry it out. Otherwise, you get a mythomaniac. And, of course, the inevitable exploitation of this for psychological warfare purposes. What explains the drive for a totalitarian state? There clearly is one. The question is, what is the point? Haven't the moneyed elites of this country done pretty well under the current system? What is it that forces them to go further? The Bush machine, I submit, is a CIA, Brown Brothers Harriman, Skull and Bones, Bush family, neocon, oligarch faction.
And the surest way to avoid attacks on our own people is to engage the enemy where he lives and plans. We are fighting that enemy in Iraq and Afghanistan today so that we do not meet him again on our own streets, in our own cities.